I'm Connor Nacken, Senior Researcher at the Intergenerational Foundation. We're a research charity fighting for a fairer deal for younger and future generations in the UK. We work on some of the big policy challenges shaping the lives of younger people, from housing and student finance to taxation, the labour market and the environment. Our work focuses on exposing intergenerational unfairness and trying to propose practical, evidence-based reforms. In this new podcast series, we'll be speaking to some of the UK's leading experts on the issues that matter most to younger and future generations. My guest today is Dr Julian Limberg, Senior Lecturer in Public Policy at King's College London, who specialises in tax policy and inequality. Julian, thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
So as an academic working on issues of taxation and the politics of taxation, I'm keen to hear about how you first came to the topic and why you're interested in it.
So I started studying actually comparative political economy. It's a field in political science that is very much interested in what the state does and mostly focuses actually on the spending side. And I found that interesting, but at some point I just thought, well, how do they actually fund all of these things? And in political science, that was a topic that wasn't that prominent. It was mostly done mostly by economists, I would say, but kind of the political processes, ideas, interests, institutions shaping tax policy were not that prominent. So I became interested in that and started my PhD working on this issue. Yeah,
that's fantastic. No, and I think it is something that I'm sure we'll come to later today, is that tax is a political issue. It's not a technical issue. Well, it's partly a technical issue, but it's primarily political. So you've written extensively in the past on how tax policy shapes inequality. So I think in one of your recent papers, you found that large tax cuts for the rich tended to actually increase income inequality, but didn't produce any positive results in terms of employment or growth. So I suppose to start us at the broadest level, what is the relationship between tax policy and inequality in countries like the UK and other advanced economies?
Yes. So I think we can think about this in two ways, thinking like a political economist, basically. One way is, of course, how tax policy shapes inequality. And we know that, as you already mentioned, we looked at taxes on the rich, and actually we've seen in the last 40, 50 years a lot of reforms that reduce taxes on the rich quite substantially. And we were interested what are actually the effects. And there we saw exactly what you said, that looking at income inequality, there was an increase in income inequality in those countries that did these reforms, and not so much in terms of like economic development. And we also know that with overall tax levels, not just on the rich, that those countries that actually tax more tend to have lower levels of inequality. Crucially, though, the effect can also go the other way. And that's something that I'm also very interested in, how inequality patterns actually shape preferences for people over tax policy. And there's this very dominant belief that inequality itself should lead to changes in tax policy, like more progressive tax policies, higher taxes on the rich, etc. But there, the results that we have are way more mixed. So it's not always the case that inequality in itself leads to a change in tax policy.
Yeah. It's very interesting. I think we'll come on to some people's preferences about tax a little bit later. So in that paper, when you were looking at the impact of tax policies on inequality, the finding was that large tax cuts for the rich increase income inequality, but they don't have any of these other positive effects on employment or growth. That seems to be a pretty remarkable finding given a lot of the policy discourse in advanced economies over the last few decades. I think from Ronald Reagan in the United States to Margaret Thatcher in the UK, the dominant argument was that by giving tax cuts to richer people, they'll employ more people, they'll spend more money, and will have all these broader positive impacts. So I was wondering if you could talk me through why that was a surprising finding, perhaps, given that dominance of the policy discourse?
So we see an impact on inequality, but not so much on aggregate economic outcomes, meaning like overall employment, overall GDP development, and things like that. And actually, we came into this and thought we might. It's quite intuitive, right, that we would say progressively lower taxes on capital were also part of the indicators that we looked at, should lead to some kind of better overall aggregate economic outcomes. But yeah, no matter how we tweak the models, how we change the specification, it's all very boring technical, but we couldn't find any effect on that, yeah.
Yeah, it's a pretty remarkable finding. I think it did get a bit of coverage at the time, I think.
Yeah. It was quite new for us all of a sudden to get that coverage and to speak to journalists.
But it obviously touched on a nerve for people.
Definitely.
Like I think a lot of people, and certainly when I read the paper, I was my reaction was, well, this is obvious, right? You know, and I'm sure some other people would have had much more different reactions.
It was very polarized, actually. And the reactions were actually in two ways. One was like, this is obvious, right? And the other reaction was, this can't be true. So you can see how polarized this belief is in the end, which we think contributes even more to the need for kind of like, data-driven approaches to look at these things.
Absolutely. So something at IF that we kind of specialize in and focus on is thinking about growing inequalities between different generations over time. So not just in terms of income, but in terms of wealth, housing opportunities, and economic opportunities more broadly. So I suppose, to what extent do you think the tax system, in the UK and other advanced economies, has contributed to growing divides or inequalities between different generations?
Yes, that's a good question. So it definitely has contributed to inequality overall, income inequality, wealth inequality. And my hunch would be that particularly wealth inequality is where that falls along generational lines. Income may be a bit less, but wealth is certainly the factor that falls along those lines. And we've also seen like a strong decrease in all kinds of taxes related to wealth. So lots of countries have repealed net wealth taxes in the past few decades. Inheritance taxes actually have been reduced quite remarkably in many countries. And we had like a big paper where we looked at inheritance taxes worldwide. And that's the only tax that has been repealed in almost a third of all countries that had an inheritance tax. And I think that's crucially where the intergenerational aspect is affected. I think wealth inequality probably, particularly in the UK, consists of three main pillars, in my opinion. Like, one is, of course, financial savings, you have your ISAs and so on, and that accumulates over the life course, right? The second one is pension, which is a big part of it, particularly in a country where you have a lot of financialized pension. But the third biggest part is housing, or like probably the biggest chunk of the overall inequality is housing. And that has seen a strong increase in recent years, and also is strongly connected to the way we tax actually property, wealth, or the way we don't actually tax it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think in some of our previous research, we were looking at home ownership rates by age over the last 20, 25 years. And the only age group for whom home ownership rates have increased have been the over 65s. And obviously as a relatively lightly taxed asset relative to when you go to work and you earn an income, the kind of tax rates you're paying on that versus the massive stores of wealth that have the windfall gains from across the housing market. So I suppose in your view, when you look at tax systems like the UK, do you think the tax system in general tends to reward over-accumulated wealth more so than income from working?
Yes. So it's still the case that income from work is taxed to a larger extent than income from capital, right? So if you have income from wealth, basically capital income, right? So dividends, things like that, that is taxed to a lower extent than income that stems from you getting like a wage, basically. And that we've seen in many countries. So there the UK is not the exception, but that taxes on capital income tend to be lower than those of wealth income. And those, of course, stem also from accumulated wealth, right? The second thing is consumption and income taxes, which are mostly, borne by those with lower incomes and lower wealth, also have actually not decreased to the extent that taxes on wealth have decreased. So that's a fundamental change there as well. And for me, the question with this is then actually under which conditions would politicians react to that and adjust and actually increase taxes on wealth, and which taxes on wealth as well. That's the other big question, right? And that hasn't happened so far to the extent we would expect. Well, there's more wealth inequality and automatically you have like higher taxation of wealth. It didn't happen.
I suppose for someone who's listening, it might be a bit confusing why we tend to apply much lower tax rates to unearned income from different sources of wealth. So proponents of these tax cuts or reductions in taxation over time for capital income or income from savings and investments, what are the kind of arguments that are often put forward to say why taxes on those types of income should be lower than the taxes that we would pay from working?
So I'll try to do that in like little technical terms, right? I think the crucial thing for capital incomes and everything connected to capital income was always the fear of tax evasion, basically, worldwide. So what that means is that capital income is taxed where your residence is, in the country of residence, and you're legally obliged to say, this is all of my capital income, and that is taxed. Now, up to a few years ago, countries didn't have full information on capital income that people had from capital that they might have had abroad. And so there was a low risk of getting caught if you don't, truthfully declare that to HMRC or whomever, right? So the likelihood of tax evasion, so the illegal evasion of taxation, the likelihood of getting caught was low. So countries found themselves in a tax competition. The good thing, this has changed a bit. So there has been like international cooperation in the last few decades where many countries now automatically exchange information, banking information of accounts that they have. And there's research that shows that from then onwards, actually, tax rates on capital have increased again. So for instance, on dividends and so on. So there is a change.
Yeah, interesting.
But before, and that was a crucial driver that explained like the divergence between taxes on like income from work and from dividends, for instance. And they used to be taxed jointly, right? And only afterwards, these like dual income taxes that allowed to differentiate them have developed.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I think that's a really good context and perhaps helps set us up well for the next questions I wanted to ask you about the wealth tax. So I think in the UK and in many countries, there's been a lot of discussion about taxing wealth, not work. So I think some of the proponents and political parties who are in favour of some kind of a wealth tax see it as a pretty obvious response to rising inequality, while there are many others who say that there are all these practical difficulties and it won't raise the revenue that's expected. Yeah. Based on your research and expertise, do you think a wealth tax in the UK would achieve what its potential supporters hope for? Or do you think it would be better to focus on reforming some of the existing taxes with inheritance taxes?
I think there are two dimensions to this. The first dimension is political practicability. And wealth taxes, when we poll this, and there are also other research who poll this, try to find out how popular it is, net wealth taxes tend to be way more popular than inheritance taxes. So those are, from political support, those are the taxes where it's easier to get political support. Inheritance taxes, people don't like them for a variety of reasons. It's always seen as the state interfering into the unit of the family and these kind of things. When it comes to whether wealth taxes would achieve what people think they would achieve, I think it depends on what the focus is there. So we did some research looking at wealth taxes historically, because they've been around for like 100 and 150 years, and we looked at which conditions lead to countries introducing a wealth tax. And it was never really inequality as well. It was always in like dire fiscal situations after major crisis when governments really try to get money from wherever they can. That's when they introduced wealth taxes as well. Wealth taxes were never the money machines that people believed them to be, because the tax base is much narrower. It's hard to make a state out of a wealth tax, basically. It can generate some extra revenue, particularly if you're in difficult fiscal situation, but not as kind of like the thing that funds all of the things which I think some proponents might think it actually funds. So I think that it can't achieve. It can achieve redistributional aspects. And it can achieve a reduction of inequality, as we've already said, intergenerational inequality strongly being connected to wealth inequality. That definitely. And another thing that it might achieve, which I think is talked about little, but we did a recent survey where we looked at that, is actually it might also help indirectly to increase support for other broad-based taxes to support the state. In a sense that when people think like the very wealthy get away with tax being rather low, they also don't want higher taxes on the middle class, basically. So you think like this is unfair, why should the middle class pay more if those people get away? So if it kind of increases this idea of proportionality and of like everybody contributing, it might also help to generate more revenue to pay for things that are urgently needed for at the moment. So that it could achieve.
That's a really interesting point, because I read that paper and I found it fascinating. Essentially that if you show people how little, on average, the very, very wealthiest pay in tax, well, one, they think that they should pay more tax, the richer people, but also that they themselves should be, like middle income earners should be paying less tax as well. So I think one of the questions you raised in that paper was that when people become aware of just how little tax on average the very, very richest are paying, it kind of presents a broader fiscal risk to the broader tax base.
Yes, there's a risk that it broadly undermines the tax state, which is built on these broad tax pillars like income taxation, consumption taxation, and so on. So there's a risk that if there's kind of this fiscal exodus of the very rich, that it might undermine the main funding sources of the state, yeah.
Is there a case for a wealth tax that goes beyond the fiscal case? Could it be a useful device perhaps for democracy to decrease radicalism or improve cohesion?
Yeah, so I was always skeptical of this argument when it came out like 15 years ago. So that was I think the big point in also the Piketty books and so on that said like this is a risk to democracy if we see a huge increase in inequality, particularly at the top of the very rich. And this was the 2010s and so on. It was like, well, is it or is it not? I think time has proven him right to some extent with that. And I think we see that now, the way that huge levels of inequality at the top can kind of pose a danger to democracy because of the wealth that is accumulated and how rich people make use of that wealth. I think that's one crucial aspect that comes along with it, right? If we see all of the things about concentration of media ownership, of other ways that wealth is used in order to undermine democratic processes at the moment, particularly in the US, I have to say. But I think we see some of those things in the UK as well. It's definitely a thing that might have an impact on like societal cohesion and the functioning of democracy as well. Yeah.
So I know you've done a bit of work in inheritance tax on the past, which you've mentioned. But do you think in a country like the UK, where it's increasingly obvious that familial wealth really shapes someone's life chances, do you think inheritance tax should play a bigger role within the tax system? Because it generates a relatively modest amount of revenue for the government. And as you said, people really dislike inheritance taxes. They're often seen as a death tax and very confiscatory for people. But with the amassed wealth of particularly the boomer generation through pensions and housing, there's going to be this huge intergenerational transfer of wealth over the next few decades. So given that, do you think inheritance taxes should play a bigger role within the overall mix of countries' tax bases?
The problem is really how to make it politically feasible, I think. And that's a problem. And we also know that actually it is unpopular, but the popularity often stems from that many people don't have an opinion on inheritance taxation because it's just nothing they're in some kind of way concerned with because they won't be affected by it and so on. So there's some very good colleagues of mine who worked on like inheritance taxation and how to make it, whether it's politically feasible or not in the UK, and they find that people who don't really have housing wealth, for instance, or whose parents don't have strong housing wealth, they tend to not care about inheritance taxation. So those with more wealth are more likely to care, and they are also more likely to have negative opinions about that. So I think it's also a bit, to a certain extent, about politicization of the issue and whether people can make the case for actually the positive effects that come along with it, particularly, as you said, with that generational change where a lot of wealth, which is also like tied up in housing, again, it's like a common theme in the UK, I would say, gets passed on from generation to generation.
Yeah. It's always one of those issues that as an economist you think to an extent the politics gets in the way of good economics.
Yeah.
I think moving on, do you think the tax system in the UK is unfair to younger generations?
It certainly puts a higher tax rate on younger people. And I think many people might perceive that as unfair just because the way we tax income compared to how we tax wealth and income stemming from wealth.
I think we've touched on a few points about this, about people's perceptions of tax and fairness. So I think a lot of your work, a common theme has been that people's views on taxation aren't just narrowly shaped by self-interest, irrational self-interest of getting away with the least they can pay in tax, but also perceptions of fairness, which is something that we think a lot about in our work. It'd be good to hear a little bit more about what kinds of fairness arguments seem to matter most when people are thinking about who should pay more tax. And I suppose particularly whether there's any information on whether those perceptions or those answers differ between different age groups or generations. So do younger people versus older generations have different views on who should pay more tax?
Yes. No, that's a very good It's a very good point. There are different dimensions of fairness that are often differentiated. One is just ability to pay. So you think it's fair if somebody has more, that they pay more, which is basically ability to pay. That doesn't tend to change so much. That is fairly stable. The second one is whether inequalities and whether, for instance, wealth or whatever is perceived as deserved. And that's kind of basically the idea of, is it luck or is it hard work and so on, which shapes it also crucially, shapes fairness perception and also support for tax policy. But I think the most crucial one that I have focused on, and that might also actually be very strongly connected, at least historically, to intergenerational aspects, is whether certain groups are systematically advantaged by the state. And I have to start a bit further back historically to explain that. So there's one period in time in the advanced democracies where taxes on the richest members of society really increased substantially, and that's the 2 world wars. That's where we see way stronger increases in taxes, on inheritance taxes as well, top inheritance tax rates, top personal income tax rates, all of that. And one aspect of this is, of course, well, wars are expensive, you need to pay soldiers and weapons, all that cost money, yes. But there is more beyond that. So there are 2 American political economists, Ken Shivey and David Stasovich, who've written a whole book on that, where they basically show that what caused these strong increases during the world wars was just not only the need for revenue, but rather the idea or the perception that some people, particularly older people, were systematically advantaged during wartime. With the idea as those that went to war, they were younger, more likely to be conscripted, whereas older people often didn't have to go to war, and often actually profited because they had the capital that accumulated for wartime increased demand for goods and so on, factory owners and so on. And during that time, the arguments were politically made that also actually were then supplied, that was an unfair treatment by the state, so an unequal treatment of some younger generations which were already also poorer compared to older generations. And the argument was then, well, in order to correct for that, we need a conscription of wealth. And that was via higher taxes on inheritance and top incomes. And that's what we see in those time periods. And this is a very powerful argument to make because you say we're basically correcting something where you have been treated unequally by the state itself, by society. And I looked at that a bit in the wake of the Great Recession to see whether bank bailouts and so on might have a similar effect. And we see that not to such a strong extent, but there were these similar arguments made, and we also saw a slight increase again in top income tax rates and so on. The problem is, though, these arguments have to be made politically, and they're often not made that strongly politically anymore. I think you could have made the same arguments during the pandemic as well, frankly, right? To say, like, we had younger people, often poorer, smaller houses where they lived in and so on, that were affected by lockdowns, to basically support, help, good reasons for that, of older people who are more vulnerable and so on. But the argument to kind of have like something similar to the conscription of wealth, something like a lockdown of wealth or whatever you would call it, right, to kind of compensate for that unequal treatment, they were not made anymore politically. And I think those arguments are really powerful. And there's recent research that tries to manipulate exactly that argument that I just made experimentally in like survey research. And they do find that it actually increases support for all of these tax policies. So yeah, I would say those are the most powerful ways of kind of changing fairness perception.
That's very interesting. I suppose, do you think there's an opportunity now, there's a parallel with some of those historical examples as countries across Europe trying to find extra money to fund their defence forces? Obviously, we're living in a very unstable geopolitical time. Again, the people who will be burdened by that or have to go to war will be younger people. Perhaps now is somewhat of an opportunity for a similar argument to think about how we meet our defence commitments?
Yes, definitely. So if these arguments are made, and particularly like who is treated how and who is treated preferentially, there is the chance for that. But yeah, the crucial aspect is just this argument has to be made politically.
I've got some questions on people's expectations versus their willingness to pay. Yeah. So I think one of the political difficulties in many advanced economies, but perhaps particularly in Britain, is that what people expect the state to provide, but what they're willing to pay in taxes doesn't always line up. Yeah. So do you think there is a growing mismatch between that in, I suppose, the UK in particular? Mm. And is that something that is going to be particularly acute in ageing societies like Britain, where you've got relatively more older people that require more services and more funding, and I suppose a shrinking relative working age population. So yeah, what's the kind of like mismatch like?
So it exists. It's often dubbed like the something for nothing phenomenon, right? So we just tell people, or people want something but they don't want to pay. I think it's particularly important for aging societies because one of the biggest bills that all countries face at the moment is pensions, right? So that's where a lot of pressure comes from on public households, particularly with like growing cohorts, baby boomer generation retiring and so on. So that's like a really strong focus. And at the same time, the tax bill is lower for those, right? So often don't fall under income taxation anymore. I mean, it depends on the country and so on, but not to such a large extent under income taxation. Consumption taxation, yes, but that everybody pays that. And then, as we already discussed, taxes on like property, wealth, and so on are relatively low. So there's probably a stronger mismatch there, which is particularly important because that group is electorally relevant. Right? That's a big group that can really tilt the needle in elections and so on, and parties try to kind of appeal to them and might actually make these arguments like you can have something for nothing there. So that's definitely the case. In order to get at that, I think what many try to do is to make these trade-offs between tax and spending more visible, and to see what happens actually when we make these trade-offs visible. The problem with those things is then, of course, that's not how these things are talked about politically, right? It's mostly about we want the triple lock or whatever is in place, but we don't want to pay higher consumption taxes or higher taxes on income. So that's definitely, with growing fiscal pressure and at the same time like a limit to what current tax systems can do and how much is taxed, something that will become stronger over time.
I think that aligns so much with our research that I think the future of the welfare state will be one of the defining issues, I think, over the coming decades, and particularly when you have a growing share of the public resources going towards older generations. You've got to pay for it somehow. Yeah. And I've often heard it put about the UK that the UK, if they want a Scandinavian or European-style social welfare system, they've got to be prepared to pay European or Scandinavian-style taxes.
Yes, for sure. I mean, there's still a big difference in what is paid in the UK than like in continental Europe. I used to work in Germany beforehand and came here and actually was positively surprised by this might sound strange to listeners, but I was positively surprised by the income tax bill that I face, basically, because it's much lower than what I experienced in Germany in terms of how much I was left afterwards. Yeah.
Returning to a question I asked before, in your research or other research that's been done, do you pick up on different generational perspectives on tax? So is it the case that younger people tend to, because they're often, if they've just got into work for the first time, they might have their first tax bill. Certainly when I received my first tax bill, I was somewhat surprised. Does that kind of first interface with the workforce lead to certain perceptions of, well, I'm paying seemingly quite a bit of tax, why aren't other people paying it? And on the inverse, we often hear something from, I suppose, pensioners that they've paid taxes their whole lives. That seems to be a very common thread in older people's views on taxes. I've paid my fair share, thus I'm entitled to all these benefits in retirement.
Yes, no, for sure. That's definitely an aspect. And I mean, the extent to which you are exposed to taxes, tax exposure has like a crucial impact on your individual support or opposition to that as well. There are some intergenerational divides over taxes as well, although I think they are not because of like age or things like that themselves, but rather the underlying factors that are connected to it. So where there's the strongest difference, I would say, is over carbon taxes and things like that, where younger people are way more supportive of it than older people. When it comes to wealth taxation, for instance, there are differences, but those are crucially driven by the wealth that people have already. So if you control for that, actually the impact of like age itself disappears to some extent. I mean, at the moment in the UK, there's this huge discussion about like younger people who face the combination of like income taxes, which are basically being increased because thresholds are not increased and so on, together with like this whole student loan thing, which is really gaining political momentum right now. So that does have an impact as well, the exposure to taxes, yes.
Do you think that's part of the reason why you see young people now with such strong support for political parties like the Greens that are proposing wealth taxes. They seem to be as far as I know, one of the only parties proposing wealth taxes. And so I suppose that's one question. Then two, do you think there is a missed opportunity for parties like the government at the moment, the Labor Party, to be doing more on these kinds of things? And just from a political perspective, obviously there are these big differences in voter turnout.
So for the wealth tax aspect definitely, because that is quite popular also among younger people, right, who don't have like the wealth, who might think there's an impact on their overall material effect. So there's definitely something behind it, particularly if that's politically supplied and it aligns with that. Although I think the support for the Greens at the moment also comes from other aspects, particularly on the positioning of Labour on what we in political science really strangely call like the second dimension of political conflict. So when it comes to aspects like immigration and so on, that's also a crucial driver there. But I think that you combine that with something that is really popular among young people, wealth and wealth taxation basically, is definitely something that aligns with what younger people predominantly want in terms of policies. As I said before, I think there's a bit of a mismatch by what it can deliver in terms of the revenue that you get from such wealth taxes. When it comes to Labour, I think, yes, I mean, this is less empirical now and more based on what we know, thinking about this in the political context. I think there is a missed opportunity to think a bit more about that share of the electorate, basically, of younger people, often like in urban areas, more progressive and so on, to get them back, to think about the distribution of wealth and how to tackle that and how that might actually help those people materially. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think one of the trends in the research that we've been looking at, we had looked at per person spending by age over the last 20 years to try and get a sense of how the broader resources of the state are distributed. And one of our findings was that when you look at per pensioner spending versus per child spending over the last 20 years, the gap has increased by 170% in real terms. Yeah. So that's all being driven by things like the triple lock. And also then when you start to look on the taxation side, there are all these exemptions built into the tax system of pensioners not paying national insurance and other different inequalities like that. Our view, I think, is that there's a huge opportunity to start to rectify some of those things, and student loans and other different areas in the tax system would be a great place to start.
100%. And it's popular as well. So in these surveys that I mentioned where they kind of pivot these things against one another, it's not that like increasing pension generally works. It's more like these other things, these what we would call social investment as well, that tends to be popular. There is a lot of political support to be gained from engaging in these policies, for sure.
Absolutely. Given all that we've discussed today, how do you see the landscape of intergenerational fairness in the UK? I suppose now relative to perhaps 20 or 30 years ago, what are the most salient things? I think we've already touched on housing and a few other things here, but how do you see the landscape of intergenerational fairness?
Yeah, the intergenerational divide has strongly increased, which probably strongly aligns with wealth inequality increasing. As we mentioned beforehand, I think it pivots strongly or strongly focused based on kind of the housing market in the UK, which is a massive driver of all of this, and kind of the changes in house prices over the last 20 years and the increase compared to what happened to like income from work is quite striking. So that's a development that is definitely strongly pronounced there and strongly connected to overall wealth inequality.
Yeah, and I think it's a tough thing sometimes when we have to do it. We have to be careful about talking about age versus generations as well. And it's always going to be the case that older people are wealthier. They've had more time to accumulate.
Yes, exactly.
But I think it's when we look at actually relative of those older people when they were younger, how much did they have? And then for people who are currently young, how much are they likely to have in the future when there are no more defined benefit pensions and they might not have a house? That's where the picture, when you start to look at it on a cohort basis, does look increasingly unequal. Yeah. I suppose given that, if you were in the position of His Majesty's government rings you up and they said, we are interested in reducing inequality in the UK and improving fairness, what would be 1 to 2 policies or reforms that you would advise to Rachel Reeves to implement that could be realistically implemented, let's say, over the next 5 years?
Yes. So I think the technical landscape is better for a wealth tax. It depends on the exact policy design and so on. But because we have like a better international landscape as well with exchange of information, everything I mentioned and so on, that could help. The design is crucial, but it should probably also tap into housing wealth, particularly at the very top. because actually this could help change kind of the overall increase in housing wealth by making very big houses more expensive. That kind of like suppresses the prices, right? So it has an impact on that. I think that would be the main focus based on my expertise that I would highlight, which can then also basically help to generate more revenue for other things that are needed and for the growing bill that governments face regarding the welfare state, particularly because pension payments are going up.
Yeah, fantastic. Are there any non-obvious ideas out there? There'll be things that capture the public zeitgeist at any given moment, but there'll be other things that are non-obvious but also beneficial?
Yeah, very straightforward. I mean, the other thing that's often very much around, but I think that's also in the public eye, is kind of the alignment of capital income taxes with personal income taxes. And I think what is helpful there, and that might not have been made that strongly, is you can make the same unequal treatment argument as well. Because basically what you have is that the state treats some type of income different to other type of income. That is an unequal treatment by the state, which comes along with like you tax income that comes from work, which most people think is some kind of more based on merit than just putting money away and then waiting what happens to it, is seen as unfair. And I think that argument, in order to supply that, could be made much stronger to say like, look, we're treating people unequally here as a state, and we could correct for that in order to increase fairness.
And presumably as well, if you were to increase these capital income taxes, you could potentially also decrease the taxes that exist on earned income so that people keep more of what they earn.
Yes.
And then that will have all these flow-on effects for the economy. Yes. One of the big issues at the moment is that there are so many incentives to reclassify income or to earn income in certain ways that are really distortive as a tax system. Yes. There's obviously an equity argument here, a fairness argument, but there's also an efficiency argument as well.
Sure. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for your time, for coming in.
Thank you very much.
I certainly enjoyed the conversation.
Yes, me too.
I think one of the things that really stuck in my mind from it was this focusing on the unequal treatment point as a real driver of perceptions of fairness. Because it's very rarely enough to just highlight an inequality and say, therefore we ought to do something. To bring people on board, have to focus more about the different structural treatments that different groups get in society as a reason to put forward for tax reform. So thank you for that. It's from brilliant insights. If you've enjoyed today's episode of the podcast, you can find more episodes in our podcast feed. You can find us online at if.org.uk or visit us on Instagram at Intergenerational Foundation. Thank you for listening.